open in that moment, and I knew she was going to knock it down.
How does it feel? How does it feel to just get a triple double in general?
Right, let me know.
The night inside Gateway Center Arena in College Park, Georgia, felt electric from the moment fans began filing through the doors. The Atlanta Dream faithful arrived early, proudly wearing their team's colors, filling the lower bowl with noise that seemed to reverberate through every steel beam in the building. By the time tip-off approached, the hum had become a roar, part excitement, part desperation, part defiance. This was not just another game. For both Atlanta and Indiana, this was a defining test, a moment that would either extend a magical run or bring it to a close. For the Indiana Fever, the weight of history hung in the air. It had been a decade since the franchise last reached the WNBA semifinals. 10 long years marked by coaching changes, roster shakeups, and painful rebuilding seasons. For veterans like Natasha, who had been on that 2015 squad, the memories were vivid. That earlier run ended with heartbreak against Minnesota, one possession shy of something greater. Returning to this stage now with a new generation of teammates, felt like the chance to rewrite a story that had remained unfinished for too long. And yet, it wasn't nostalgia or history that drove Indiana on this particular evening. It was survival. A season that had begun with cautious optimism had turned into a marathon of injuries, setbacks, and constant reinvention. At different points, the Fever bench resembled a triage unit. Crutches leaned against chairs, ankle boots propped under the scorer's table, and taped shoulders and knees everywhere in between. Coach Stephanie White admitted that sometimes she'd look down her sideline and shake her head in disbelief, wondering how they would even get through the night. But what the Fever lacked in numbers, they compensated with resilience, selflessness, and an uncanny ability to rise when the game demanded it most. The matchup against Atlanta demanded everything. The Dream, younger and hungry, had the crowd behind them and momentum in their hands. They pushed the pace, attacked the rim, and forced Indiana to bend defensively. But the Fever refused to break. Each possession became a battle, not just of X's and O's but of wills. As the fourth quarter wound toward its conclusion, the scoreboard reflected what the Fever already knew. They had trailed all night, never once holding the lead. Each time they strung together defensive stops, the offense stalled. Each time a shot finally dropped, Atlanta answered with a counterpunch. It was like climbing a mountain whose peak kept shifting higher into the clouds. Then came the final 2 minutes, the crucible where seasons are defined. The Dream looked poised to close it out. They had the home crowd surging, the energy pulsing through the building like a living organism. Indiana's offense sputtered on back-to-back trips, resulting in frantic, broken possessions that looked destined for turnovers. And yet basketball often turns on the strangest of bounces. A loose ball caromed off the hardwood, skipped awkwardly between a tangle of arms, and landed fortuitously in Indiana's hands. It wasn't clean. It wasn't pretty. But it was life. Coach White would later call it a couple of breaks going our way, but in truth it was more than luck. It was the product of persistence. A group refusing to give up on any play, no matter how disorganized or hopeless it appeared. That hustle kept the door cracked open. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A technical foul assessed against Atlanta's A.D. Durr, referred to simply as AB in the presser. The call didn't swing points immediately, but it was something bigger. A composure check, a mental turning point. White later admitted that in her mind that was when the tide turned. The Fever, who had been absorbing body blows all night, suddenly sensed that the game was there for the taking if they could simply remain poised. What followed was a showcase of grit, execution, and belief. Indiana tightened up defensively, forcing Atlanta into rushed looks. On the other end, the Fever, who had been ice-cold for much of the evening, found just enough rhythm to convert. Still, the breakthrough had yet to come. With less than 10 seconds remaining, the Fever finally seized the lead, their first of the entire second half. Kelsey Mitchell, Indiana's steady scoring anchor, willed her way into the lane. Bodies collapsed, rotations broke down, and the ball found Aaliyah Boston at the perfect moment. Boston, calm beyond her years, finished at the rim with 7 seconds on the clock. For the first time all night, Indiana was ahead. The arena gasped. The Fever bench erupted. But the job wasn't done. On the ensuing possession, with the Dream desperate for a response, Lexi Hull delivered the defensive play of the game. Reading the inbound like she had seen it in a film session hours before, Hull darted into the passing lane, poking the ball free and denying Atlanta the chance to answer. It was a single play, lasting only a fraction of a second, but it sealed everything Indiana had fought for over the course of 40 minutes. The buzzer sounded, and with it, a decade of frustration gave way to triumph. The Indiana Fever were heading back to the semifinals. Stephanie White leaned into the microphone with the kind of quiet conviction that only comes from lived experience. For weeks, months really, she had been repeating the same refrain to anyone who would listen. This group is special. On the surface, it might have sounded like typical coach speak, the sort of praise one expects after an emotional win. But to White it wasn't filler. It was truth. This group is just really special, she said again in Atlanta, her voice steady, but carrying a current of pride that seemed to grow stronger with every syllable. Special for White didn't mean flawless execution or a stacked roster. In fact, the Fever had spent much of the season fighting uphill against circumstances that would have broken lesser teams. They'd lost players to injuries at critical stretches, forced to shuffle lineups and redefine roles on the fly. At times, White could glance down her sideline and see a row of crutches, boots, and ice bags where there should have been rotation options. And yet, the adversity didn't fracture them, it fused them. The power of we over me. At the heart of Indiana's resilience was a culture deliberately cultivated by White and embraced by her players. The we over the me. Where other teams might have allowed egos to clash or frustrations to bubble over, the Fever made selflessness their currency. Players pulled for one another even when their minutes fluctuated, even when the spotlight landed elsewhere. Veterans lifted up rookies. Bench players celebrated like starters. Every individual, White explained, was encouraged to be fully themselves, to shine in their own way, and to know that their contribution, big or small, mattered. That inclusivity wasn't a buzzword. It was tangible, showing up in the way the Fever's bench exploded after a defensive stop, or how teammates rallied around whoever had the hot hand that night. White believed that kind of chemistry was worth 12 to 15 points a game, an advantage that doesn't show up in the box score, but one that could tilt the outcome when margins were razor-thin. It's good for 12 to 15 points, she said, almost daring skeptics to disagree. Couple that with resilience, toughness, grit and fight and you always give yourself a chance. A team defined by grit. Grit had become Indiana's calling card, the word most often associated with their identity. They weren't the most talented roster in the league on paper, nor the most experienced. But they fought, relentlessly, stubbornly, sometimes beautifully, sometimes chaotically. White often marveled at how her team responded to setbacks. A blown assignment on defense rarely spiraled into 2 or 3 bad possessions. A missed shot didn't linger in their heads. Instead, the Fever regrouped, tightened their focus and came back swinging. That ability to absorb punches and still move forward was what had carried them through close games and ultimately delivered them to the semifinal stage. I love riding with these guys, White said simply with the kind of sincerity that left no room for doubt. I love coaching them. I'm just so incredibly proud. It wasn't just words. Her eyes said the rest. A mixture of exhaustion, satisfaction, and anticipation. The season had demanded everything of her and her players. But the return was nights like this one in Atlanta. Victories born not of dominance but of persistence. The invisible fuel. Resilience in sports is often reduced to cliches. Mental toughness, next play mentality. But for the Fever, resilience was something more textured. It was the invisible fuel that allowed them to play with joy despite obstacles. White credited her players for cultivating a locker room environment that made that joy possible. Instead of letting frustration about playing time or injuries corrode trust, they leaned into each other. They cracked jokes, built traditions, and created a safe space where every personality had a role to play. That camaraderie made hard practices bearable and tough games winnable. This inclusivity wasn't only about keeping spirits high. It translated directly to the court. When players know they're valued, they dive for the loose balls. They sprint back on defense when fatigue sets in. They sacrifice shots to find the better look. The Fever had proven that intangible chemistry could swing tangible results. The coach's reflection. For White, the post-game podium wasn't just a place to break down X's and O's. It was a moment of reflection on a season-long journey that had tested her as much as it had tested her players. She had seen teams crumble under far less strain. She had seen locker rooms turn toxic when adversity piled up. But this group was different. They refused to let setbacks define them. They refused to splinter. White's voice, equal parts calm and resolute, carried the weight of that perspective. The resilience, the flexibility, the welcome and inclusive nature of this team, their selflessness, the ability to let each teammate be who they are and shine at their best, and to lift them up in those moments, it's just special. He paused, letting the words settle. Then, almost like she was speaking directly to her players rather than the reporters, she added, "I love riding with these guys. I love coaching them. And I'm just so incredibly proud." In those words, you could hear not just the echo of a coach breaking down a game, but the heartbeat of a leader who knew her team's success was built on something deeper than schemes or stats. It was built on trust. And that trust, forged through adversity, was what made the Indiana Fever dangerous. When Natasha Howard took her seat at the post-game podium, the smile tugging at the corners of her mouth said as much as any words could. 10 years had passed since she last wore an Indiana Fever jersey in this kind of moment, 10 years since the franchise had reached the semifinals. Back then, in 2015, Howard was still early in her career. Talented, raw, trying to carve out her place in a league filled with giants. Now, a decade later, she was back with the Fever, not as a supporting piece, but as a veteran leader, the anchor whose voice and presence had guided a younger roster through peaks and valleys. "It actually feels good," she said, leaning toward the microphone. "Because in 2015, that could have been our game right there when we played against Minnesota. But I'm grateful. We're happy to be back in the semifinals again. Feels like a whole 360 all over again. Like I can replay the 2015 playback in my head again. But I'm just so excited that we're back here with this group of young women. And the job is not done yet." Her words, simple but weighted with history, connected 2 generations of Fever basketball. For the fans who remembered 2015, the heartbreak, the near miss against the Lynx dynasty, Howard's presence in 2025 carried symbolic significance. She was the living bridge, proof that the franchise's struggles since then had not erased its identity, only delayed its resurgence. From role player to leader back in 2015, Howard was not yet the force she would later become. She was a promising young forward, still learning the league's speed, still finding her confidence. That Fever team leaned heavily on Tamika Catchings, a legend in the twilight of her career, whose leadership defined the era. Howard's role back then was to complement, to absorb lessons, to prepare for a future that felt far away. The future arrived faster than anyone could have imagined. Over the next decade, Howard blossomed into one of the league's premier forwards. She became a 3-time WNBA champion, a 2-time All-Star, and the 2019 Defensive Player of the Year. She learned how to thrive alongside superstars, how to adapt to new systems, and most importantly, how to lead. So when she returned to Indiana, older, wiser, battle-tested, she didn't just bring skill. She brought credibility. Every lesson, every championship run, every locker room dynamic she had lived through became part of the guidance she offered her teammates. Steady in the storm, coach Stephanie White called Howard's leadership steady, a quality that proved invaluable during a season marked by injuries and inconsistency. When younger players wavered, when the grind of travel and setbacks threatened morale, Howard was the one who steadied the ship. "Tasha's our vet," White said, almost as if the nickname alone explained everything. "Her leadership throughout the course of this season has been incredible. It's been a season that's had some peaks and valleys, and she's led us through it. She's experienced championships. She's experienced everything in this league. She's been Defensive Player of the Year. He's played with superstars. He understands it. And no matter what, her leadership has been so steady. Our team has been a reflection of that. And I'm so proud of her." That reflection could be seen most clearly in moments like the one in Atlanta. When emotions ran high, when the Dreams crowd threatened to overwhelm, Howard didn't flinch. She reminded her teammates to breathe, to focus, to trust. Her calm became their calm. The weight of legacy for Howard, the semifinal berth, was not just about what it meant for the 2025 roster, it was about what it meant for the franchise as a whole. She had seen the Fever at their peak, one possession from glory. She had seen them at their lowest, struggling for relevance, scraping for wins. And now, to help bring them back into contention, felt like restoring something bigger than herself. "This feels like 2015 all over again," she repeated, almost in wonder. But the difference, of course, was who she was now. No longer the wide-eyed role player, Howard now stood as the veteran presence, the one young players like Aaliyah Boston, Lexi Hull, and Nalissa Smith looked to in huddles. The journey made the moment sweeter. For Howard, the 2025 Fever weren't just another team she happened to play for. They were a continuation of her story, a second chapter that allowed her to honor where she had started and shape where the franchise was going. Unfinished business, and yet, as she reminded everyone, the job was not done. The semifinals were a milestone, but not the finish line. If anything, Howard's experience made her more aware than anyone how fleeting momentum could be. A decade earlier, she had felt the sting of falling just short. This time she wanted more. "I'm grateful," she said again, her voice thick with emotion, "but the job is not done yet." The room fell silent for a beat, the weight of her words settling in. They weren't just a reminder to her teammates, they were a promise. When Natasha Howard took her seat at the post-game podium, the smile tugging at the corners of her mouth said as much as any words could. 10 years had passed since she last wore an Indiana Fever jersey in this kind of moment. 10 years since the franchise had reached the semifinals. Back then, in 2015, Howard was still early in her career. Talented, raw, trying to carve out her place in a league filled with giants. Now, a decade later, she was back with the Fever, not as a supporting piece, but as a veteran leader, the anchor whose voice and presence had guided a younger roster through peaks and valleys. "It actually feels good," she said, leaning toward the microphone. "Because in 2015, that could have been our game right there when we played against Minnesota. But I'm grateful. We're happy to be back in the semifinals again. Feels like a whole 360 all over again. Like I can replay the 2015 playback in my head again. But I'm just so excited that we're back here with this group of young women. And the job is not done yet." Her words, simple